After the critical and financial disaster of Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, it was assumed that the original Star Trek franchise was over. Paramount gave Harve Bennett the green light to reboot the Star Trek franchise and produce a Starfleet Academy prequel movie using younger actors to play younger versions of the original cast. They considered Ethan Hawke as a young James T. Kirk and John Cusack as Spock. Producers referred to the project jokingly as Top Gun in outer space. The screenplay was written by Harve Bennett and David Lowery, the man who wrote Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and it was going to be titled Star Trek The Academy Years. The movie would start with an old Leonard McCoy talking to a group of Starfleet Academy graduates on how he met Kirk and Spock. It would feature the individual childhoods of Kirk and Spock, and then it would move to the Academy years where Kirk and Spock would meet Bones McCoy and Montgomery Scott. They would face off against a new villain and then part ways to presumably meet years later on the USS Enterprise. You can see some similarities as well as differences from the J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek prequel. As you can imagine, this did not go over well with the stars of the original cast, and it created a huge power struggle with Harve Bennett on one side and Shatner, Nimoy, and the rest of the cast on the other. The situation got very ugly, and even Gene Roddenberry got involved, siding with the original cast. Fortunately for the cast, the 25th anniversary of Star Trek was approaching, and this gave the original stars a little bit of a publicity bump, along with some political power. They ended up winning the power struggle, and Harve Bennett lost. Paramount head Frank Mantuso sided against Harve Bennett, and thus ending an epic 10-year relationship between Bennett and Star Trek. He felt very betrayed by Paramount since he was responsible for the success of Star Trek II, III, IV, and V. He had single-handedly ushered in the golden age of the Star Trek film franchise. Now he was out. With Harve Bennett gone, Paramount began to develop the final swan song for the original Star Trek cast, a fitting goodbye to the cast and characters that had served the fans for 25 years. Chekhov actor Walter Koenig came up with an idea titled In Flanders Field, which is a reference to the World War I poem. In the movie, the Federation joins the Romulans to fight the Klingons in all-out war. The three would join together to fight a race of powerful, worm-like aliens. It was rumored that in this script, everyone except Dr. McCoy and Spock would die. Frank Mantuso and the producers asked themselves who had benefited the Star Trek franchise the most. Two names came up: Leonard Nimoy, who directed Star Trek III and IV, and Nicholas Meyer, who wrote and directed II and wrote half of IV. Leonard Nimoy was made executive producer for Star Trek VI, and Nicholas Meyer was brought in for story ideas. Nimoy went to Meyer's house, and the two started brainstorming. Leonard apparently said, "What if the wall came down in outer space? After all, the Klingons have always been the stand-ins for the Russians, and the Berlin Wall had fallen a year earlier." Then Meyer replied, "Okay, we start with an intergalactic Chernobyl, a big explosion, and we got no more Klingon Empire." The two decided to make the movie a deliberate story about the contemporary political climate between the US and Russia. Chernobyl was a catastrophic nuclear accident that occurred in the Soviet Union on April 26, 1986, when a nuclear power plant exploded, and it is considered the single worst nuclear accident in history. It added to the economic strain to a struggling Soviet economy, as well as strengthening the mistrust of the world. It also exacerbated the mistrust that the Russian people had of its own Soviet government. Chernobyl is generally considered among historians to be the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. On June 13, 1990, the Berlin Wall was officially dismantled, and in December 26, 1991, a few months after the release of this movie, the Soviet Union formally disbanded and ceased to exist. Leonard Nimoy hired Nicholas Meyer to write the screenplay since Meyer was familiar with Star Trek and Nimoy knew he could write fast. He had written Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, in 12 days and had revised the script for Star Trek IV also in less than 20 days. Leonard also suggested that Meyer direct the film. Nimoy did not want to direct the film, as he felt that if he did, William Shatner would have been jealous, and Nimoy did not want to risk him getting upset. Here's something really interesting. In the original script, Nicholas Meyer wanted to establish a little introduction that a certain passage of time had passed since Star Trek V. There would have been individual vignettes about each of the original cast. Captain Kirk would be with Carol Marcus and would be living happily ever after on his farm until a Starfleet officer would come to his door and Kirk would be escorted to help the envoys gather the original crew and bring them out of retirement. The next scene would go to Spock, who has retired from Starfleet and is now a Vulcan actor. He would be playing Polonius in a Vulcan version of Hamlet, obviously a play on Leonard Nimoy's own life as a classic Shakespearean actor. Bones McCoy would be introduced as being bored and getting drunk at a posh, high-class dinner for wealthy retired physicians. Chekhov would be in a bar playing chess and losing to an alien. After collecting Chekhov, Captain Kirk would tell him, "You realize that all Betazoids are psychic," and Chekhov would say,
"I was robbed."
Uhura would be a host in a call-in radio show and would just be bored at her job and would be very happy to see Kirk. Montgomery Scott would be a Starfleet engineering professor lecturing in a large auditorium about the cloaking technology of the Klingon bird of prey. He would be dismantling the Klingon bird of prey from Star Trek 3 and 4 in front of a large audience of students. The biggest difference would have been Sulu, who was not a captain of the Excelsior, but a taxicab driver in a busy, futuristic metropolis. However, in the second script, they decided to change Sulu from a taxicab driver to Captain Sulu, and he, not Kirk, was going to go around gathering the original crew. Unfortunately, Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer had to abandon this idea, mostly due to budgetary reasons. After analyzing these scenes, they realized that they would have had to film in different locations and create new sets. The cost was estimated at an additional $10 million. While fun, it would have been very expensive without adding anything to the plot. The idea had to be discarded. They abandoned the opening sequence and came up with a new scene where Captain Sulu would have his own starship, the USS Excelsior, and his own 5-year mission. It would be Captain Sulu who would witness the Klingon Chernobyl explosion. Here, Sulu says his 5-year mission was cataloging gaseous anomalies. This was to have paid off at the end of the movie when Captain Sulu has the idea that the cloaked bird of prey expels gas. Therefore, his ship has the equipment to modify a torpedo. However, William Shatner wanted his Enterprise to come up with the idea, so it was changed in the script. For the movie, Nimoy and Meyer decided that the movie should also have a Gorbachev-like character and created Gorkon. Gorkon was based on Gorbachev, but also Gandhi and Abraham Lincoln. His name would be a mixture of Gorbachev and Lincoln. In the script, Saavik would return. She was supposed to betray the Enterprise and Kirk. Apparently, when Gene Roddenberry read the script, he hated this and objected. First, he was upset that they would turn Saavik, a fan-favorite character, into a villain. Second, Gene Roddenberry objected to the fact that Kurt and the crew are racist and bigoted toward the Klingons. He believed that bigotry would eventually disappear in the 23rd century and did not want such bigotry depicted in his future universe. Roddenberry and Nicholas Meyer had a yelling match with Meyer storming out of Roddenberry's office. The studio ignored Roddenberry and went ahead with Nick Meyer's idea. However, due to Gene Roddenberry's position as creative consultant, Meyer was obligated to show him cuts of the film. They continued to have just ugly arguments throughout the filming of this movie. Roddenberry was 71 years old and was in bad health. He died 48 hours after seeing the final cut of this film. Meyer never realized how sick Roddenberry was and always felt guilty for the way they argued in the last few months before his death. When this film was released in the theaters, it was dedicated to Gene Roddenberry. DeForest Kelley, who played Bones McCoy, was also 71 years old and also in pretty bad health and had considered retiring before this film. However, Paramount offered to pay him $1 million to be in it. DeForest Kelley decided to sign on for one more film in order to have more money to leave to his family. Nick Meyer had Christopher Plummer in mind when he wrote General Chang. He had to personally go to Christopher Plummer and convince him to do it. Plummer was friends with William Shatner and was excited to get to work opposite him. Originally, Christopher Plummer was supposed to have a full head of Klingon hair, but while putting on the makeup, he liked the look of the bald Klingon and asked if his General Chang could remain bald. Meyer agreed, and the bald look of General Chang was born. To complete the look, they added an eye patch that is bolted to his skull. Meyer originally wanted Jack Palance to play the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon, but Jack Palance had to turn down the role to finish up City Slickers. David Warner, who had just played the Earth Ambassador in Star Trek V, ended up winning the role. When they applied the Klingon makeup to Warner, the artist intentionally made him look like a cross between Abraham Lincoln and Captain Ahab from Moby Dick. They even gave him a walking stick like Captain Ahab, although it had a distinct Klingon twist. During the dinner scene in the movie, Chancellor Gorkon says,
"You have not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon."
I thought this was a hilarious line at the time, but fans took it even further. In 1996, in reverence to this line, two members of the Klingon Language Institute, Nick Nicholas and Andrew Strader, actually translated the entire play of Hamlet into the Klingon language and published it through pocketbooks. At the opening of this movie, when Captain Sulu observes a planet Praxis exploding, we see a shockwave ring explode outwards. The special effects were done by Industrial Light and Magic, and they decided to try something new that had never been seen on screen and would indicate the explosion's massive size compared to the tiny starship. They decided to put in this explosion ring, which would dwarf the giant starship, giving the planetary explosion its scale. The wave also serves the story in that it causes destruction in its wake, and Captain Sulu has to solve this problem by steering the ship into the wave, thereby showing us his experience and really what he's made of as captain. This shockwave ring was the first time something like this had been put on film, and hereafter, this effect is going to be known as the Praxis effect. The Praxis effect would be used again and again in Hollywood anytime the filmmakers wanted to pick a huge explosion. It would be used 3 years later in Stargate, and used again 1996 in Independence Day. It was used again in 1998 in Armageddon, and most memorably used twice in the Star Wars special editions. George Lucas, who owned ILM, used the Praxis effect for both the destruction of the Death Stars in Star Wars' New Hope and again in Return of the Jedi. The Praxis effect has now become kind of cliche anytime there is a planetary explosion. However, the Praxis effect, while looking visually cool, is probably scientifically inaccurate. Expert astronomers have stated that if there was a huge explosion in space, the shockwave would likely go out spherically in all directions, not in a two-dimensional ring. In the original script, the part of Lieutenant Valeris was supposed to be Lieutenant Savick. They first approached Kirstie Alley, who was busy filming Cheers. Robin Curtis was not approached. They then approached Kim Cattrall, who had been the original choice to play Savick in Star Trek II. She turned it down, saying she did not want to be the third actress to play the same character. Therefore, Meyer, who really wanted Kim Cattrall in this role, rewrote her as a new character, Lieutenant Valeris. Apparently, Kim Cattrall named the character herself after Eris, the Roman goddess of strife. Kim Cattrall was already famous for her breakout role as Honeywell in 1982 film Porky's. By 1991, her three most famous roles were Gracie Law in Big Trouble in Little China, the titular role in Mannequin, and Karen Thompson in Police Academy. However, it would be another 5 years until her iconic role as Samantha on Sex and the City. Star Trek VI had several themes running through it. The first was the analogy of the Cold War ending and the Iron Curtain coming down in space. The second was that of racism. The Iron Curtain analogy worked well because the Klingons were always the stand-ins for the Soviet Union, and Klingon culture was being revered by fans due to the Next Generation TV series, where the Klingons and the Federation had been at peace for over 70 years. By 1991, fans were dressing up as Klingons for conventions and learning how to speak the language. They were no longer the villains. The second theme of this movie was racism. In fact, the line, "Guess who's coming to dinner," is a reference to Sidney Poitier, the story about a black man going to meet his white girlfriend's parents. It was supposed to be spoken by Nichelle Nichols, but fortunately, she refused to read the line, and it was read by Chekhov,
"Guess who's coming to dinner,"
thereby sort of diffusing the racial tension of the line. There was another line by Uhura, where she would say, "Yeah, but would you want one of them marrying your daughter?" Thankfully, Nichelle Nichols refused to say this line, and the line was dropped. For the dinner, the food served was squid dyed blue and other foods dyed purple. This gave the meal a very alien look. None of the cast wanted to eat the odd blue food, especially after it sat underneath the hot lights for hours. Director Nicholas Meyer offered $20 cash to anyone who ate the food in front of a camera, and William Shatner happily obliged, eating the blue squid with gusto. During the assassination scene, the Klingon blood is shown to be pinkish purple. In the Next Generation TV show, Klingon blood has always been red. However, having a blood-red massacre would have ensured an R rating. By having the blood be pinkish, it ensured a PG-13 rating. The pink blood was supposed to outline the differences between the anatomies of humans and Klingons, making McCoy's inability to save the Chancellor Gorkon more understandable and sympathetic. However, the pink blood of the Klingons did not stay in canon, and Klingon blood reverted back to red after this film. Even by the next movie, Star Trek Generations, Klingon blood is once again shown to be red. This film also utilized CGI to depict an anti-gravity scene where we see pink blood floating in space. This was one of the first times something like that had been put on film. It worked very well and really took advantage of this new medium of computer-generated special effects. When Kirk and McCoy are captured, they are taken to a Klingon trial. The attorney for the defendants is Colonel Worf, played by Michael Dorn, who is supposed to be the great-grandfather of our Worf from the Next Generation TV show. For the Klingon court, the production team created the illusion of an endless mass of hundreds of Klingons using good old-fashioned Hollywood special effects creativity. In the front row, closest to the camera, there were 6 actors playing Klingons, wearing full Klingon makeup. In the next row were 15 Klingon actors wearing more simple makeup, while the dozens of actors behind them wore inexpensive Klingon masks. Behind them, the production team purchased 200 commercially available Worf action figures and had them rocking back and forth using sticks and tiny motors. For the interior shots of the penal colony, Rural Penthe, most of the scenes were shot on Paramount sound stages. This necessitated the use of a lot of artificial plastic white powder to resemble the snow. Apparently, this plastic snow got into everything, and the cast and crew were cleaning fake snow from the shoes and socks for weeks after shooting. The interior scenes were shot inside a large cave in Griffith Park in Bronson Canyon in an old abandoned mine. Only the entrance of the cave was used for filming, but was filmed at night to give the illusion that they were deep inside the caves. For the exterior shots of Rural Penthe when Kirk, McCoy, and Marta travel across the planet, the production team found a huge glacier in Anchorage, Alaska. This was not an easy sequence to film. This site was not accessible by road and was only gotten to by helicopter. A second unit team of stuntmen playing the 3 actors flew to the site for filming. The site was very cold, often reaching -50 degrees. For filming, the stuntmen could only wear the wool clothing seen in the movie, causing them to almost contract pneumonia.
Once again, we've saved civilization as we know it.
After our original Star Trek team has saved the galaxy one last time, and after 25 years, Meyer wanted to leave them with a perfect screenshot that resembled a curtain call. At the suggestion of Nicholas Meyer, the movie ended with a quote from Peter Pan.
Second star to the right. And straight on till morning.
This symbolized the cast's desire to remain young and play Star Trek forever. Originally, the idea was to have the actors sign off as their characters. It was a unique idea. However, it was later decided that the actors would sign as themselves. Made on a budget of $27 million, it made $97 million and was a box office success. It was also a critical darling with mostly positive reviews. Critics thought this was a huge improvement over The Final Frontier, and fans felt better about the original cast, leaving on this note rather than the disastrous Star Trek V. The Undiscovered Country was nominated for 2 Academy Awards and won the Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film. After this movie, numerous expanded Star Trek universe novelists began to write fan fiction starring Captain Sulu. It turns out that an Excelsior TV show was actually being considered. And in 1996, in the 3rd season of Voyager, in the episode Flashback, George Takei reprised his role as Captain Sulu on the USS Excelsior. This was planned as a possible backdoor pilot to pitch an Excelsior TV series. A few years later, when Deep Space Nine had finished and was off the air, and Star Trek Insurrection had just bombed at the box office, with the ratings for the last few seasons of Voyager slipping, Paramount wanted to do another Star Trek series to pump some new life into the Star Trek franchise. One of the ideas considered was an Excelsior series starring George Takei as Captain Sulu. In the spring of 2000, thousands of Star Trek fans, including an organization called the International Federation of Trekkers, a fan organization of over 5,000 members, encouraged Star Trek fans to write into Paramount showing their support for a Sulu TV series. They were joined by numerous fan groups, including the Media Action Network for Asian Americans, who also wanted a TV show that had a positive depiction of Asian Americans in the media. However, on May 11, 2001, Paramount and Star Trek producer Rick Berman announced that the new Star Trek series was going to be called Enterprise, and it would be a prequel about the first voyage of 1701. Many fans, including George Takei, were very disappointed. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, was a worthy conclusion to 12 years of the original cast on film and serving the fans for a total of 25 years. It was a fun movie that allowed the cast to retire with dignity and grace. The next film will focus on transitioning the franchise over to the next generation. We will talk about that film in the next episode.